Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I would like to provide a demonstration of the ListView adapter view. I want to go through an Android Studio project. I would like to create the adapter, create the list view, and then also create the data and bind that data to the list view. So let's bring up Android Studio. And we have our old project here. We want to create a new project because this is going to be a list view example. So let's go ahead and close this project. Create a new project. We're going to name this list view example. I'm going to keep all the defaults the same. Minimum SDK. We all know this pretty well by now. Empty activity. And create a default resource file. Now this is going to be an example of a basic adapter. An adapter where we have a simple text view that's going to be included in the list view. A list view itself it's a view, an adapter view that contains a list of scrollable items. In this case, a list of text views. The list items are going to automatically be inserted to the list using the adapter that we create. It's going to pull the content from a string array and convert each item result into a view. And then it will be placed in the list. So the goals for this are to create the list view, the adapter, and then set the adapter. So the first thing we need to do, if we remember our list from the last lecture, or the previous lecture when we talked about the array adapters, is we have to create the data set in a resource file. And we're going to do this, we're going to be creating a string array. So we want to create a new resource file that has this information in it. We don't want to use an existing resource, we don't want to use the existing value string file, although you could. So we're going to go to our resource file, we're going to go to values, and we're going to create a new values file by right-clicking, saying new values resource file, and we're just going to name this, let's name it my string array. All lowercase letters, and we're going to set the source set for main, just how it's released. We're not going to use any qualifiers, just going to hit OK. So it's going to create this empty file here. We're going to create a string array resource. So inside the resources, we're going to do this manually. Inside the resources tag, XML tag, we're going to create a string array type, and it actually shows up. And we're going to set the name equal to my string array. And we're going to end that tag. Inside the string array, we're just going to populate it with a few items. We'll do something like item, and the way that you populate it is you put the string in between the item, start and end tags. So we'll just say JSON. I actually want to make a lot of data for this because I want to make sure the scroll shows up. So the scroll view is automatically added in the list view. It's pretty nice. So I'm just going to copy and paste this and just add maybe 10 or 12. And this data is not going to be very useful. I'll just add different numbers, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. Hopefully this will be enough to make the list view scrollable. Okay, now that we have our string array, our next step is going to be to create the layout resource file that contains our text view object. And so to do this, we have to create a new resource file, a new layout resource file that just contains a text view. So we're going to right click on layout, we're going to say new, and we're going to go to layout resource file, and we're going to call this simple list item because it just contains one text field, simple list item 1. We don't need a root element. We'll take this out, see if that works, and we'll keep everything else the same. So you have to specify a root element, so we'll just keep it linear and then we'll manually delete it. So now we'll go to the system simple list item, and I think you do need some kind of layout because remember all the views have to be in some layout. We'll use a constraint layout, so we're just going to close this preview and change it to constraint layout because we're trying to use constraint layout for everything. There we go. And so we now have our constraint layout. We can go back to our layout editor and just add a text view. So we're going to just drag it down into the constraint layout. We can add properties to our text view if we like. We should give it an ID at the very least. So we can give it an ID by clicking the dot, dot, dot and creating a new resource for the ID. Which would be, let's just name it my text view. Not sure if we're going to need this in our code, but we might as well just have it that way. We also have some text in there. For now, we don't care about having that as a. We'll just leave it as default. We don't care that it doesn't have it. It's not going to have a string because we're going to populate it with our adapter. So if we go back to our resource file, we have our simple text view. We could again add some specific properties to this text view. The font. We could make it left side justifiable and stuff like that. But for now, we'll just keep it as it is. So our next step is going to be to create the adapter. So to create the adapter, we have to modify Java source code. Remember that the resource file contains our graphical content. The source code is going to be our behavior. So after we set the content view to the activity.main, first thing we want to do is we want to get our string array. So we want to create our string array in code. So we can just create a string object, and it is an array. We can just say my string array. And we have to get this from our resource file. So we can call the getResources method. And from getResources, we can call our getStringArray method. These are specific calls that you want to use. And we want to use the array that we created. So we want to say r.array. That's how you access an array. And we have our myStringArray right there. And so there we have our string array. This is going to be assigned to our string array in code, myStringArray. Parentheses look good. Everything looks good there. And now that we have our string array, we can now create our adapter. So it's going to be an array adapter. Just going to say array adapter. Whoops. Array adapter, and it's going to be this type string. It's generic. We're just going to call it adapter, and we're going to say new array adapter. And if you remember from the previous lectures, the array adapter class takes the constructor will take the context as the first argument. So we can pass in the this pointer for the context because the context automatically gets passed in as part of the activity. The this pointer means it's a this class, this object. We then want to use our layout class for our simple list item. So we can say r.layout, and then we can access our simple list item. And then our last thing that we're going to adapt is the data, which is the myStringArray. And so we can just do something like that. And there we go. We don't have all of our import statements correctly, so we can click the array adapter and we can just say Alt-Enter, and that will automatically allow us to import our class. And what we also want to do when we're always writing code is we want to work in small steps, constantly compile to make sure we don't have any errors, and we should be testing. This is a rather small subset of code, so I'm only going to test at the end. But when you're writing more code, you want to work in small steps. You want to write small steps of code, compile it, and test it. This way you can isolate your errors. If you write 50 lines of code, compile it, you may have a lot of mistakes, so it's going to be harder to fix your compilation errors. And it's also, even if you do compile, you're going to go and test, and you may have bugs in your code. And that's also going to be hard to compile. So we work in small steps. We constantly test, constantly compile. So let's compile just to make sure we don't have any issues right now. Bring up our Gradle console. And it says that the Gradle build finished. Gradle console, there we go, and it was successful. So we're good so far. Now that we created our adapter, the last step, or the last two steps, is we need to create the adapter view using the layout editor, and we need to create an adapter view object and call setAdapter. So now I want to go back to my layout editor in my activity main, and I want to go to the activity main, not the simple list item. And in the activity main, we want to get rid of that hello world because we don't need that. and we want to use a list view. So we can scroll down here, we can go to containers, we can go to our list view, and we can just drag it on down. And again, we're going to keep all the defaults as they are. It's going to match the parent for both. We don't need to do any margins or anything for this example. If you wanted to make it look nicer, you could change the margins, change the padding, and also adjust things. But now that we have our list view, we're good to go on that step. And our last step will be to set the adapter. We can check out the text as well for the XML to make sure everything looks good there. So now we go back to main activity.java. Now what we need to do is to add code to use our adapter in our view. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get our list view from our resource file. So we can say list view, create an instance of that object. Just name it whatever you want. I usually use camel case. You want to use good naming conventions. So as you notice throughout this, I'm using naming conventions that represent the data. We're going to call the find view by ID method. This, remember from previous lectures, helps you get different views from your resource file. And we want to get the list view. And I'm not sure if I actually named the list view. So that's one thing I forgot to do. So let's go back to our activity main, to our list view item, select that, and for our property, let's name it an item. And this doesn't need to be a resource because it doesn't, it is a resource when you specify the ID. You don't have to specify any value. So we're just going to type it in, and we're going to say my list view. And now we'll have an ID, and if you look at the XML, it added a new ID. And that's how we access it from our Java source code. So now we can go back to the Java source code, and we can access that list view. So we can access it by saying r.layout list view, or my list view, I think it was called. And we may have to access it by r.id, my list view. So you want to remember that. To get an ID of different view controls, use r.id. To get layouts, use r.layout. That was a mistake on my end. Well, notice that we have an error here because ListView doesn't have the import statement. So again, we can select Alt-Enter, and we can say import class. Now that we have our ListView, the last step is to just set the adapter. So now we use our ListView object. We call setAdapter. And this IntelliSense is great where it automatically does the code completion for you. We can say setAdapter. And then we can pass in our adapter, which is our adapter object that we created in line 17. And that is it. So now we want to compile. We want to run this in the emulator to see if the data that we created in our string array is displayed in the list view. So let's go ahead and build, make project. Make sure we don't have any errors, and we do have errors. So here it's saying incompatible types view cannot be considered in list view. We need to cast our find view by ID to a list view. We need to do something like that, and that's converting the object. So find view by ID will return a base view object. You need to convert it to the view that you are actually assigning it to, which in this case is a list view. So we'll save that, Control S. We'll build again, make project, bring up the graded console. I don't know why it keeps going away. It says build successful. So now we can run it. We want to run the app. Say run app. We'll bring up our emulator. And we'll bring up our Pixel API emulator. We'll say OK. So our emulator's coming up. It's rather quick on my machine. So now the app comes up and it actually crashes, which was intended. I did something wrong, and I want to show you what I did wrong. So if we go back to our source code looks good. Everything's good. The problem is in the activity main file where I created the problem is in the simple list item file where I created my text view. You don't need to have this inside of a layout. It can be outside of the layout. You don't need any of that code. It can be a text view by itself. The only thing you need to do for the text view is so you can also remove the constraint layout. You just need a regular text view and with the schema represented. So now, when I recompile this and run it, we should see our list view. So that's important thing to notice. When you're creating the view that goes in the list view, you don't need to include it in a layout. Let's recompile. I'm getting an inval token because I accidentally created the or deleted the ending tag. Let's rebuild this and run it. We're able to compile. Let's run it on the emulator again. This time when it comes up, you'll see that it provides the text. I did want it to come up in a regular scroll bar, but we can also fix that. So if we want to see the scroll view, I can think of another way to do it. Inside of our Java source code, you can also use one of the Android resource files if you don't want to create your own text view with your own properties. You can do this as well. Instead of loading our layout simple list item, Android has one defined for you. Inside android.r layout simple list item 1. You can use the Android one if it's just a simple text view and you don't need to modify. So let's build that. Run the app. And now the text is a little bit bigger. So the resource for the Android resource layout file is a little bit bigger text. So that's a list view with a basic adapter. Things to notice is creating the adapter and setting the adapter. Also, creating your own layout file that contains your text view, or using Android r.layout simple list item 1, which is defined by Android if you don't need to make any modifications. In the next lecture, we're going to try to create a custom adapter where I show you how you can add more than just the text field to a list view. Thank you.